Hello, welcome to my business podcasts. I'm Dr. Audai from Speak English with draudai.com. In this episode, I'll try to give you an overview of inflation. But first, let me ask you this overarching question. Are you feeling the squeeze? In other words, have you been living on a tight budget in the last few months? Well, it's no doubt that we have started seeing prices going up all over the world, followed by almost 2 years of lockdown. We might have all felt at the start of 2020 that it was a tough time for household living standards. For example, energy bills are the center which a lot of people are still talking about. That has squeezed household incomes, and it's going to particularly squeeze the household incomes of low income households. That's because inflation has surged in the past few months, and if your fixed income wasn't keeping up with what's happening with prices, your real standard of living would start to decline. It's taken economists and observers by surprise. If we went back to the start of the last year, very few people saw this big spike in inflation coming. So, what does inflation mean and what's its impact in the community? The straightforward way of describing inflation is it's just the average rise in prices across the economy. Inflation reflects the wide rise of prices or the fall in the value of money. We usually think that it's only about the rise of prices, but it can impact the value of money, which may result from too much chasing goods or limited services that might lead to a surge in prices. Inflated prices don't only hurt the economy as a whole, and only those consumers making purchases experience the increase. For example, new auto prices have risen sharply because of vehicle shortages driven by a lack of components. The increase in car prices doesn't importantly affect the customer unless they want to buy a vehicle. Higher prices in one sector also don't lead to general inflation across the economy, but price increases for a wide range of categories will affect and weaken consumers' spending power. To cut it short, it's each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services, causing a reduction in the purchasing power per unit of money. This could be a loss of real value in the medium of exchange and the unit of account within the economy. At the start, inflation could be reduced by buying that old car or avoiding air travel. Now, record prices are concentrated in essentials such as groceries, housing, and energy, raising the cost of just getting by for many. In other words, the breakdown of what has fueled inflation each month since the start of last year can be summarized as that the pandemic has put its thumb on the economic scale. If only energy prices dropped, and if only COVID's long incident finally receded or dwindled away, then we can say that food price inflation would be vanquished. It could be true that when these situations happen, the rate at which food prices are increasing and rising should ease. So, at the moment, inflation across all of the advanced economies is driven by a few things. It's driven by high global energy prices, feeding through the domestic heating bills, etc. It's driven by, in particular, what economists tend to call durable goods. That's things like cars, things like furniture, those sorts of big purchases that we make are things that last a long time. For example, if we look at all these shiny home working and use of technology, it's all made us more productive. That's right. The truth is, it's done damage to our productivity and it's put up a cost for firms. That's why people not getting big pay rise because firms aren't in position to afford. It's broadly a similar picture across the public and private sector when it comes to wages. Thus, the current circumstances of inflation have several causes linked to the pandemic. Consumers have spent more on services in fading COVID 19 restrictions, driving up prices for experiences such as meals out. Supply chain disruptions have started to ease, but have also contributed to inflation. Russian Ukraine war, for example, has caused a problem with a run up in wheat and corn prices that is making markets more expensive. Energy prices have gone up big time, though they have cooled down recently. Other transportation means, such as trucks, seaport, slots, and warehouse spaces, are all in short supply, resulting in costly delays and rising shipping rates for goods. Now we might ask how inflation is measured. If we ask economists about how to measure inflation, they would tell us that there are different ways of measuring it, even among government bodies. The shorthand version comes from the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is calculated using a survey of households and only covers spending in goods and services. It excludes expenditures that aren't paid for directly, such as medical care paid for a person's health insurance. Its limited set of expenditures can make a CPI more essential. That's not just a matter for the average person, however. While most economists tend to acknowledge the same causes of inflation, many disagree about which elements are most leading the price increases. For those who are on fixed incomes, whether inflation is a good or bad thing hinges on what happens with wages. If laborers or workers' pay goes up more quickly than prices increase, they can still find themselves in a good situation in a high inflation environment. We can see that the wages are growing rapidly these days, especially for lower earners, but some actions and measures suggest the growth is not keeping pace with inflation as it picks up steeply. So the risk of inflation remains on the horizon, and there are opportunities that short term shocks can deviate from the long run trajectory. In most cases, minor modifications to spending will be sufficient to navigate the source of inflation. You can adjust your spending levels over time. In other words, we are not necessarily locked into a spending limit forever. The last point here is that inflation might have pros and cons in different ways. The positive side includes increasing the value of assets. So, for example, if someone has real estate, the real value of those assets might double as a result of inflation. Whereas the negative side of inflation includes an increase in the opportunity cost of keeping or holding money, which might not be encouraging for investment and savings. What makes things worse is if inflation is fast enough, shortages of goods as consumers begin hoarding out of concern that prices will increase in the future. So, the takeaway here is that if we didn't start paying a little more for our food to help improve our self sufficiency, we would end up paying substantially more in the future when an external stock restricted our supply from overseas.